Hi, everybody. Welcome to Universe. I hope that you're all having a lot of fun so far. I'm Eileen Uchitelle. You can find me anywhere online at the handle Eileen Codes. That's Twitter, Instagram, GitHub, literally everywhere that I actually want you to find me. I'm a senior systems engineer on GitHub's platform systems team. We're responsible for Ruby and Rails and how those open source libraries and others interact with the GitHub application. I'm also on the Rails core team. For those who don't know, the Rails core team is responsible for defining the future of Rails and doing releases, patches, getting new contributors, and generally making it better for those who use it. Today we're going to talk about the unbearable vulnerability of contributing to open source. Before we deep dive into that, I want to give you a bit of background on my involvement in open source and what I mean by vulnerability. When I talk about vulnerability and open source, I'm specifically referring to contributing to open source and how that exposes our insecurities and makes us feel like we're not good enough to contribute. The vulnerability that we feel when contributing can inspire us to change the software we use and the communities we belong to, or it can be so unbearable that it's paralyzing because our vulnerability makes us afraid of contributing. I've been contributing to open source for a long time, and I still feel vulnerable, especially when I contribute to a new project or build a major feature. Vulnerability is an inherent part of open source, and I don't think that that feeling will ever go away for me. I opened my first PR on GitHub in 2012. It was a pull request to fix a typo in a README of a project that I was using. The PR was never merged because the project had been abandoned for a few years. Almost a full year later, I opened my second pull request. Mini-Profiler is a database profiler for Rails apps. I noticed that while using Mini-Profiler in my application, that there was an extra space at the bottom of the page. I thought, this is likely a CSS bug and it will be really easy to fix. I quickly found out that it was not CSS, and it took me 2 days to find the invisible UTF-16 character that was causing the display error. Even though I had spent lots of time and was on this issue and was confident that I had fixed it, I was still worried that I was wrong and my contribution wouldn't be welcome. I felt vulnerable because I didn't know what to expect. After giving a talk in 2014 at Mountain West Ruby, I learned that I'd found a bug in Active Record, which is Rails database manager. Aaron Patterson, a Rails core team member, asked me if I wanted to pair with him to fix the problem. Shortly after, I opened my first pull request on the Ruby on Rails framework. Even though I'd paired with Aaron and I knew the fix was correct, I was still really nervous about opening a PR against a repo where 2,000 people get notifications every time you open an issue or a pull request. I felt vulnerable because I was a new contributor. What if someone thought my fix was stupid? What if somebody thought I was stupid? These thoughts might seem irrational, but they are embedded in contributing to open source because we're dealing with people, not code. The other side of that fear, though, is that high you get when your pull request is merged. I continued to contribute to Rails regularly after that first pull request. Maybe it was because I had someone mentor me and help me understand Rails internals. Maybe it was because I had such a good experience contributing that first time. One of the goals of this talk is to provide ways in which you can improve your community so more contributors experience that high instead of the unbearable vulnerability when contributing to your project. This past year, I worked on a large feature for Rails called system tests. Previously, my work on Rails had been refactoring code, fixing bugs, improving performance. This was my first experience adding a major feature. And by major, I mean it was literally the highlight of the Rails 5.1 release. Working on this project reminded me how hard contributing to open source can be. I've been contributing regularly for over 2 years, but I was nervous opening this PR. I had those familiar thoughts. What if everyone hates the feature? What if someone thinks my code is bad? Even though DHH, the creator of Rails, literally asked me to build this feature, I still had to deal with reviews and comments and defend my decisions. When I opened the pull request, I had put 3 months of work into it. I had spent nights and weekends, and it was personal to me. In the time that the pull request was open, before it was merged, I received over 150 comments and 11 reviews. That's a lot of other opinions to deal with. I felt stressed and vulnerable just like I had when I opened my first pull requests. Someone even tweeted about the PR, which only drew more attention to the work. And don't get me wrong, attention is good and reviews are good, but I was drained by the endless bike shedding and nitpicking of details. None of the reviewers meant any harm. They were excited about the feature. Still, there was a level of discomfort that gnawed at me. I had been an avid contributor to Rails for over 2 years. I'd released Rails 5, and I had commit rights. Why was opening this PR a nail-biting, stress-inducing event in my life? I figured I'd be over the unbearable vulnerability by now. While I was thinking about this, something hit me. I realized that even if we get used to working on open source, we can still experience vulnerability when working on a new project or a large feature. The more time we spend on open source, especially free time, the more attached we become to the work that we're doing. And there's only one explanation for why this happens. If contributing to open source was only about writing code, it would be easy. But we all know that contributing to open source isn't easy. We're not just dealing with code or ones and zeros. No one would be worried about opening a pull request if open source was only about writing code. So if open source isn't about writing code, then that means open source is really about people. And people make us feel vulnerable. Contributing to open source is about our insecurities, fear of being wrong, and fear of showing our work to our peers. Often the thought of just pushing code into a public repository can cause anxiety. Given that, while people are the source of our vulnerability, they are also essential to the open source ecosystem. Let's take a minute to think about what open source would look like without people. Say you write a gem or library and open sourced it. Sure, it's public for anyone to use, but if no one downloads it, is it really an open source project? Open source doesn't work without users. Otherwise, you are not really sharing your code with anyone. No users means no bug reports, which means your work doesn't improve. And if you stop improving it yourself, no one will notice. While your code might be public, it's just code until someone else is using it. Let's say you have tons of users, but no contributors. Sure, you get to completely control your project, and you never have to deal with any other ideologies or opinions, but is that open source? If you stop improving the project or move on to something else, your project will kind of cease to be useful. Open source cannot survive without contributors. Imagine for a moment a world where DHH created Rails but had no contributors. Would it be as robust as it is today? Probably not. Would all of the engineers who learned Ruby on Rails and got jobs not writing Java be as happy as they are today? I don't know. I've never written Java. Maybe we all would have adopted Merb or Sinatra instead, but the community and tools would be very different from where they are today if Rails had never been open sourced and never attracted any contributors. I wouldn't be here today giving you this talk if it wasn't for Rails and its success. So I've convinced you that you need people as users and people as contributors to have a successful open source project. In that case, what are we going to do about the unbearable vulnerability? Vulnerability can be harnessed as a motivator for change, or it could deter us from contributing. There are ways we can foster a welcoming community and attract more contributors rather than deter them. Before we explore ways in which we can make better open source communities, we're going to look at ways in which maintainers make vulnerability more unbearable. Vulnerability can be a deterrent for many new and long-time contributors. Feelings of inadequacy can keep folks from contributing to your project, which means maintainers lose out on changes from other viewpoints that could make their project more robust and usable. We want to avoid creating an environment that fosters fear of contributing in favor of an environment that's welcoming and inclusive. We want to create environments and communities that cultivate creativity and inspire contributors. One of the ways maintainers deter contributors is closing pull requests without proper feedback. While maintainers do this, they don't leave room for a contributor to improve in the future. Maintainers should always explain why a pull request wasn't accepted, otherwise contributors might take it personally. Contributors spend a lot of emotional energy on contributing, and it can be demoralizing to not have your pull request accepted. Ask clarifying questions if you don't understand why they want to make a change or what their use case is. Being dismissive and not giving feedback will cause contributors to feel like their time isn't respected, and they may not contribute to the project again. Another way in which maintainers can make contributors feel more vulnerable is through violent communication. An example of violent communication is saying, "This code sucks," or "Did you even try to fix this problem?" This communication style passes the blame onto the user and shames them. This will lead contributors to feeling defensive and more vulnerable. It will deter them from contributing in the future because they don't feel respected. It's easy for context to get lost in written communication, so remember that English isn't everyone's first language, and over-communicate with nonviolent techniques to get your points across so that you don't alienate contributors or future contributors. If you want to learn more about nonviolent communication, you should watch this talk by Nadia Odonmayo. It's called "This Code Sucks," a story about nonviolent communication. Her talk explores nonviolent communication, what that means, and the benefits for using that in your communications at work. Often I see bad behavior being tolerated because someone is a high-impact member of a team. They respond to lots of pull requests, or they send lots of patches. Even though a contributor or maintainer may seem like an asset, if they're abusive towards new contributors, they will deter other contributors from coming to your project. It's important to protect your contributors and everyone on your project from bad actors and not tolerate behavior that's exclusive and offensive. A power dynamic exists between maintainers and contributors. It's important to recognize this because maintainers inherently have more power than contributors. This will always be true because maintainers decide what gets merged and who gets to contribute. Because of the power dynamic between contributors and maintainers, it's up to maintainers to set and reset the tone of the conversation. There is always going to be assholes who come into your project and demand free time from you, but most people come to your project with good intentions and they mean well. It takes a lot of energy to be mad and rude back to someone. Wouldn't maintaining projects be easier if we could diffuse stressful situations instead of aggravating them? As a maintainer myself, I have felt the pull to tell someone off. When that happens, I try to put myself in their shoes and take a walk before responding. Maybe they're just really frustrated. Maybe their boss is breathing down their neck to get something fixed. Maybe they dropped a production database because of a bug. Often taking the time to tell the contributor that I know they're frustrated quickly turns the conversation from defensive to productive. This doesn't mean giving contributors everything they want or rolling over. It just means treating them the way that you want to be treated when you're in a stressful situation. Vulnerability can be harnessed as a motivator. Being vulnerable isn't a bad thing. We've all felt it before, and we'll all feel it again. Every single maintainer and contributor has at one time felt vulnerable. When we feel safe being vulnerable, we're more creative, more inspired, and more open. If we can change open source communities to be more welcoming and supportive, they will be more sustainable and the vulnerability will be more bearable. Why is it important to create a welcoming and supportive open source community? Why does it even matter if contributors feel safe being vulnerable? Open source is a funnel. At the top, you have users. Some of those users will become contributors, and some of those contributors will become maintainers. The more maintainers you have, the more sustainable open source is because you have more backup. Making our open source communities more welcoming will attract more users to become contributors and more contributors to become maintainers. If we don't do this, then we'll end up on an island alone, maintaining projects by ourselves. This leads to less users because you can't sustain a project alone, less job offers because no one is using your projects, and less friends because you're spending all of your time working on open source instead of having a life. Imagine a world where instead of burning out on that island, the funnel didn't lose so many potential maintainers. What would the ideal open source world look like? Maybe it looks like users and contributors and maintainers all moving equally among roles. In today's open source world, many maintainers stop being users of their own product. Some even stop contributing beyond merging and accepting pull requests. It doesn't have to be like this, but I also think my ideal world would be pretty hard to achieve just because of how open source politics work. So if this ideal world isn't possible, then what is possible? An aim could be to try to make the funnel look a little wider like this. Users are still the majority of the people involved in your project, but users are more likely to become contributors and maintainers than in the previous funnel. There's less friction to move from users to contributors to maintainers and back again. Open source needs contributors. Without them, open source will cease to exist and thrive. We need to make open source more sustainable so people continue to contribute to open source and open source continues to exist. Open source is the past, present, and future of technology, and without it, innovation will stagnate. So how do we create a world that's more welcoming and supportive for open source communities so that contributors join and open source communities thrive? There are many ways in which we can make open source a better experience for everyone. Healthy communities benefit maintainers, contributors, and users. One way in which maintainers can attract and retain more contributors is through mentorship. Many of my first contributions to Rails were the result of pairing with Aaron Patterson, another Rails core team member. Mentorships don't need to be official, and they can happen organically. I just met Aaron at a conference, and after my talk, he was like, you have a bug, you found it, and we're gonna pair and fix it. Before I made my first commit to Rails, I never thought I'd be on the Rails core team. Rails is a really complicated code base, and it's difficult to get used to working on. On top of that, the community is huge. It has over 2,000 contributors to date, and at least 2,000 people get notifications whenever issues or pull requests are opened and merged. Aaron and I started pairing regularly, and it helped me learn faster and feel more comfortable contributing. It didn't erase all of my anxiety, but instead of feeling unbearable dread when contributing to Rails, I was excited. Aaron's guidance helped me navigate the code base and the community, making contributing less stressful. I knew that he had my back, and he'd help me defend decisions that I made in PRs. Mentoring can happen in many forms, from pairing to email to inviting contributors to a group chat with other maintainers. I've helped folks get their first contributions through Twitter DMs, pairing, and email. Mentoring doesn't have to be official or time-consuming. The point of mentorship is to act as a guide for your mentee and help them feel more welcome in the community. Writing up clear guidelines for contributing can help make contributors feel more welcome to your project. It's always easier to contribute to a repository that has explained what's expected rather than guessing. Each project on GitHub has their own rules for contributing. For example, the Rails project doesn't accept feature requests on the issues tracker. Other projects are fine with this type of contribution, so setting guidelines clearly for your project will allow contributors to focus on contributing rather than being worried about breaking unspoken rules. To ensure that you're providing clear guidelines, you can use some of the tools on GitHub. Be sure to add a contributing markdown file to your GitHub repository. Include any rules about contributing that are unique to your project, like requiring all pull requests be a single commit or not allowing cosmetic changes to the code. GitHub provides files that allow maintainers to set up a template for contributing to their project. Use this template to guide contributors into writing good bug reports or properly submitting a pull request. These templates are fully customizable and are simple markdown files, so you can set up the issue and PR templates for your project. For the Rails repository, we ask that issues indicate which version of Rails and Ruby that they're using. This helps us quickly triage issues based on what versions are supported, but also means that we don't need to ask contributors for that information in the future. Using issue templates reduces anxiety and frustration for new contributors. In addition to templates, Rails provides bug report scripts that can be used to replicate bugs experienced in the Rails applications. This means that users don't need to provide a full application to reproduce a bug they're experiencing. If a bug can't be reproduced by one of our scripts, then we know it's probably a gem or something specific to their data or application that they're doing. The scripts help us triage issues faster because we can see directly the behavior instead of having to guess at how to reproduce a regression. When possible, use bots or scripts to handle pull request triaging, to remove personal bias, and to ensure contributors don't feel ignored. On the Rails project, we use a bot to auto-assign pull requests to maintainers. Rails gets so many PRs that it's hard to give everyone attention, but with the assignment bot, we can focus on just what's assigned to us instead of all of the PRs coming in at once. This also helps new contributors know that someone is paying attention and will respond to them soon, and it also gives them a point of contact instead of having to spam the entire core team. We also use a linter to tell contributors what needs to be fixed, which reduces bike shedding about small details, because nobody wants to argue with a robot, because the robot won't answer you. Everyone makes mistakes. So if you see a new contributor fail to add CI skip for a documentation change or open a feature request on the issues tracker, don't shame them. Kindly tell them how to contribute better in the future. This will ensure that even though the contributor's pull request didn't get merged or their issue was closed, that they'll feel welcome to come and contribute again in the future. There's no point in putting someone down that will only chase away contributors. When you're a maintainer of a project, it's easy to think you have to do everything yourself. I think it's important to know when and how to ask for help. The good thing is that GitHub provides a clear place for you to do that. You can use your README to document areas that your project needs help. When I first started contributing to Mini Profiler, I knew exactly what Sam Saffron needed help with because he laid it all out in his project. In fact, he still needs help in some of these areas, so if you're interested in getting your first contribution, this is a great project where you'll know exactly what the maintainer wants from you. Contributors will feel more welcome to push changes to your project if they know the work they're doing is wanted. This reduces vulnerability and stress when opening that initial pull request. Asking for help in your documentation is a great way to get contributors you need to bring in contributions that you need and that they are passionate about working on to help your project be more successful. Another way of asking for help that can attract new contributors is to label issues that are good as first patches. Clearly labeling issues that are easier for beginners allows them to work on something they know they can succeed at. If you do this, you should discourage seasoned maintainers and other contributors from jumping in on these issues if they aren't urgent. This will allow new contributors to learn at their own pace without fear of someone stealing their pull request from them. One of the ways you can ask for help is by promoting contributors to maintainers. Rails wouldn't be as successful as it is today if DHH didn't share the burden of making decisions, releasing new versions, and sculpting the future of Rails with the core team. Rails core currently has 12 members. This means that all of us don't need to be available all the time for Rails to thrive. We can share the work with each other. While smaller projects aren't likely to have a team of maintainers as large as Rails, it's important to find contributors that you trust to cultivate the community around your project and help maintain your vision for the code base. Trying to maintain a project by yourself is a fast track to burnout. We can create more sustainable communities if we're nice to and respect everyone. Maintainers set the tone of the conversation, and it's important to recognize that. Yes, assholes always exist, but the majority of contributors come into your project with good intentions. One of the important things to remember as a maintainer is to not review pull requests before you've had your morning coffee. If you're like me, you're very grumpy before coffee and maybe haven't even recovered from the nightmares that you had the night before. I have personally jumped to snap conclusions when I review pull requests before coffee. It's often more likely that I'm going to be short with the user and dismiss the pull request without a proper review. Take the time to take care of yourself before reviewing pull requests. Contributors will feel more welcome, and they won't have to deal with your crabbiness. Being dismissive or rude because you haven't had your coffee could prevent contributors from helping you in the future, which, let's face it, will only make you grumpier. As we talked about earlier, employing nonviolent communication tactics is the best way to interact with contributors. You should probably employ nonviolent communication methods in all areas of your life, but right now we're just talking about open source. Using nonviolent communication will keep the conversation open. Remember that as a maintainer or contributor, you can set and reset the tone of the conversation. Recently on Rails, we had a situation where an issue got closed quickly without a conversation. This, of course, resulted in the contributor getting defensive because we weren't listening to them. I took the time to respond to the contributor and let them know that I understood how they felt and asked them what solutions might work for them. This immediately changed the tone of the conversation. Instead of being annoyed, we were able to finally talk about solutions to the problem. This does not mean that the contributor is going to get exactly what they want, but they no longer feel like we just dismissed their concerns or ignored them. Talk to the contributors the way you want to be talked to. Maintainers can use GitHub-provided tools to signal their community is healthy and welcoming. A great feature that GitHub added a few months ago is the first-time contributors badge. This badge clearly indicates contributors are new to your project. When you see this badge, give the contributor a little extra time and be a little extra helpful. When I see this badge, I take the time to congratulate the contributor on their first pull request. As a maintainer of Rails, I want contributors to have a good experience and let them know that I appreciate the time they put into Rails. Because of this, they'll be more likely to contribute again in the future instead of going to someone else's project. Another GitHub tool that was recently rolled out to everyone is the community profile, which was built by the community and safety team at GitHub. The community profile is a tool that shows GitHub's recommended standards for creating welcoming and sustainable open source communities. The community profile is located under the repository insights tab via a link called community. The community profile page will show you 6 items that make a healthy open source project: a description, a README, code of conduct, contributing guidelines, a license, and issue and PR templates. Each of these items will help make your project more approachable and sustainable. The description is self-explanatory, but next we have the README, which is the instruction manual. This is the thing that users need to read first to understand how to use your project, what your project is, and where more information is. If your project doesn't have a README, contributors won't know where to start, and users won't know how to use your software. Adding a code of conduct will attract new contributors because they know that you're serious about maintaining a professional and respectful community. Codes of conduct benefit everyone, but people from underrepresented groups are more likely to feel comfortable and welcome contributing to your project if you implement a code of conduct and ensure that all maintainers and contributors treat each other with respect. If you don't have a code of conduct, GitHub has added tools to help you add one automatically. On the community profile page, there'll be an add button that will take you to this page, and it will show you a list of code of conducts and helpful tips about how to enforce the code of conduct. As I mentioned earlier, contributing guidelines are instrumental in laying out the rules for contributing. Each project is different and unique in what they expect from pull requests or issues, so be sure to read the contributing guidelines before contributing. Rails contributing guidelines go over what to do if the bug is security related, how to find duplicate issues, using our bug report templates and reproduction scripts, as well as installation and writing patches. If your project doesn't have a contributing guideline, it will be difficult for contributors to send patches to you or bug reports that meet your standards. A license is an important part of open source because legally a project isn't totally open source until you actually choose a license. If you don't have a license, then technically you own the copyright and legally they can't really use it or change it, even though it's public. Lastly, a healthy open source project will contain the issue and pull request templates that I talked about earlier. These are important because every project is different, and these templates tell contributors exactly what information maintainers want in the issues and pull requests that they open. We've talked a lot about how maintainers can build better communities. All of this is to help new contributors feel welcome and inspired. The goal is to help make the vulnerability variable for new contributors. Now we're going to look at ways that contributors can find healthy open source projects where their contributions will be welcome. One of the easiest ways to find a project to contribute to is to look at what tools you use every day. If you build Rails apps, look in your gem file for ideas of projects that might need your help. That's how I ended up contributing to Mini Profiler. Contribute to the tools that you use because that's where you'll be most useful. In open source, users become contributors and contributors become maintainers. So with that logic, the easiest way to become a contributor is to first be a user. A great way to find a community or project that you want to be a part of is to spend some time observing the behavior of the maintainer or other contributors. First, make sure the project is active. Active projects have recent commits. Look at the top bar on GitHub to see when the last commit was. Projects that are active should have pull requests merged or issues closed in the last few days to months. For larger projects like Rails, there should be activity every few hours. For smaller projects, there might only be activity every few days or months. My first contribution to open source was for a project that was no longer maintained and had been abandoned. It didn't feel good to make a contribution that would never be accepted. There are a few ways that you can go about making changes to abandoned projects. You can offer to take over maintaining the project, or open a PR with the expectation that it won't get merged if you just want to help other people. Don't open an issue that asks, is this still maintained? Especially if it's very obviously not maintained anymore. Once you're sure the project is active and accepting new contributors, take a look at how maintainers respond to new issues or pull requests. Subscribe to a few of them on the project and see how maintainers treat contributors. Are they kind or dismissive? Do questions go unanswered or are they helpful? This will help you know what to expect when you open an issue or pull request. Most maintainers are volunteers, so being unresponsive doesn't mean that they're rude. They're just busy or burnt out. Knowing the communication style of maintainers up front can help you be more prepared when you open that first issue or pull request. Just as most maintainers are volunteers in open source, you're a volunteer too. You don't have to work for free for assholes. If a maintainer or other contributors aren't respectful of you, it's okay to say nope and go work on other open source projects. There are projects that I use in my applications that I won't contribute to because I know the maintainers don't treat other contributors the way they should, and I don't want to interact with them in order to get my bug fixed. There is no requirement that you voluntarily work on open source projects where maintainers or other contributors are rude to you. For accepted contributions and fixed issues, observe to see if maintainers give feedback and say thank you. Instead of helping contributors ramp up, some maintainers will fix pull requests for you and merge. I don't think this is okay. Yes, it's faster, but it won't help new contributors do better in the future, which means maintainers are creating more work for themselves. If you find a project where maintainers are helpful, give feedback and say thank you for your contribution. Keep working on that project because you found like a good one. It only takes 2 seconds to say thank you, and it makes open source way better for everyone involved. A big part of contributing to open source is to learn how to accept rejection. It's really demoralizing to not have your pull request accepted, but often maintainers have a vision for their project, and that's a big reason why pull requests are accepted or rejected. I've had many pull requests get rejected, and it's not fun. I understand how it feels. But don't take that rejection personally. It's all part of contributing to open source. Ask for advice on how to do better next time and apply that to your future work. Once you do find a community to contribute to, be as respectful as you want maintainers to treat you. Hitting a bug in an open source project is frustrating, but maintaining a project is really hard too. Most maintainers are volunteers, so while the majority of this talk was about how maintainers could do better, contributors could do better too. Treat maintainers the way you want to be treated if you were a maintainer of that project. There are a ton of resources to help contributors and maintainers have better experiences and build more sustainable communities. First Timers Only, Your First PR, and Code Triage help new contributors find projects that need help and are actively seeking out new contributors. Open Source Guide, written and built by my lovely colleagues at GitHub, is a resource for new contributors and maintainers with ideas about building more welcoming communities, finding your first pull request, and implementing Open Source Fridays at your job. Open source isn't about writing code. Open source is really about people and our insecurities, interactions, and our unbearable vulnerability. The thought of contributing to open source and interacting with toxic communities can be paralyzing, but open source cannot survive without contributors. It's our responsibility to build welcoming communities so that open source is sustainable and inspirational. We can do this by mentoring, asking for help when we need it, and demanding that we all treat each other with respect. Let's build a world where instead of ending up on an island, burning out from maintaining projects alone, we get to work with bright minds and share ideas in a healthy, sustainable community. The benefits are endless. Building a better community will attract more contributors. This makes open source communities more stable and sustainable. Maintainers and contributors are less likely to burn out because there are more people to share the burden of contributing with, less demand on their time, and more emotional support. Let's build open source communities where less contributors experience dread when contributing because they're vulnerable and afraid, and more contributors experience that high because they were inspired by their vulnerability to build something amazing for your project. We must work together to create more sustainable open source communities. The future of open source depends on all of us. I hope the maintainers in this room are inspired to go out and build better open source communities. I hope that the folks in this room who have never contributed to open source feel inspired to move past that vulnerability and contribute. And I hope that everyone will respect each other and recognize the vulnerability that every single person needs to overcome in order to contribute to open source. The job of growing these communities doesn't lie solely on one maintainer, one contributor, or one project's shoulders. The responsibility is all of ours to build the communities we want, whether we're a contributor, maintainer, or user. Together, we can make sure open source thrives by building welcoming communities. Together, we can make the unbearable vulnerability of open source bearable. Thanks for listening.